Hope you can hear me. So I am Jayadeba Jena, and I lead the API design in PayPal. My team in PayPal owns the API program we run for all of our APIs there. So the aim, kind of the what I'm going to talk here is the best practices in the framework that I've been using in PayPal, and the program that we have been running for years since we started building our REST APIs, and what it kind of takes to how we were successful in kind of enforcing the principle, the framework in all our APIs. Um, so to take you through the PayPal API journey, so when we started way back in 2004, all we had was REST SOAP APIs. That's when we launched our first kind of APIs. And from 2004 to 2013, there we had multiple iterations and more kind of different version of SOAP APIs coming. And our partners, we had SDKs that are supporting our APIs, and partners were using our SDKs instead of kind of interacting with our APIs directly. So we had that model running for kind of until 2013. And after 2013, and that's a year when we kind of decided that we should kind of rethink about our platform, right? And what are the APIs we are going to build, how we are going to make them available, the services make them available to our customers. That's when we started thinking about rebuilding all of our APIs using REST. And that's when our first version 1 of the REST API, we launched it. And from there on, again, until 2018, where you see now the second major version of our PayPal APIs. Until then, we have been there were multiple REST APIs that we have launched, and we have been learning based on the customer feedback on and in the way we found out which API was successful, which was not, what are the improvements that were needed for a particular API. We learned through all that process, and 2018 is when we started building our V2 APIs and including all this customer feedback. So we have our first checkout APIs that are kind of V2 and available right now, and the customers are using it, and we are kind of migrating the customer migrating to our stack. To share, so how we built our, the time we started building our REST APIs, what are the best practices we applied? So before we built any of our APIs, what we started is building a framework, right? Or how the guidance for our developers, right? Guidance for our every stakeholder within the company to build the APIs, take the product from conception through launch. So we call it a 3 Ps of the framework. The product is basically the infrastructure, the standards, the tools, right, that used to manage the portfolio of APIs, and the actual portfolio on what are the capabilities, the services that our PayPal, the business, kind of makes sense for our customers. The portfolio contains all the business capabilities. And the program that kind of combines all this together, the metrics that we use to evaluate the quality of APIs. So what it takes kind of within the organization to understand that this is a good API versus that is a bad API. And what are if something is kind of categorized as bad API versus a good API, what are the things, how do we measure them, what is the criteria for all of them? So the program really drives all of this. So to start talking about the first P, which is portfolio, before we started building, we kind of started thinking about what it takes. So for a customer, from a customer point of view, looking at PayPal APIs, what are the business capabilities, right? What a particular customer or partner comes to PayPal and what he wants to do with PayPal. So he may want to do payments, he may want to do checkout or credit. So the first thing we did was sit down and come up with the capabilities. So there were the kind of very specific capabilities, business capabilities that we kind of categorized them into various layers. There were core capabilities, there are business capabilities, and the core capabilities are something like identity. They don't change. They don't change based on integration, one integration to another versus a business capability. They would change when the kind of there are new integration, all these things. So the first thing we did was come up with those basic set of capabilities, and all our APIs would be centered around those capabilities. And once we kind of sat down and kind of wrote all the capabilities, we had a detailed capability model. The next thing was to how to build your APIs based on what are the principles that drive building our APIs, right? What are the service design principles, and what it means to kind of build a good API versus a bad API. How do you kind of make sure they are built the right way? So we sat down and kind of wrote all the principles that would drive our service design, the API design as such. So what it means to be kind of loose couple. So for every principle we had, we sat down and kind of wrote the rules that every developer would, or kind of any stakeholder in the company would follow to build the APIs. And these are kind of the principles that kind of drove our building the APIs. Then the API standards. So once we kind of wrote down the the service design principles, then we kind of wrote down the API standards. So API standards is kind of based on all those service design principles, but it goes into the second level of details where it says what is your API style, right? When you build a particular API, how your mutation operations are going to look like, how your kind of query operations are going to look like, what your URI style, right? How your idempotent request should look like. What is your auth patterns, right? What are the status codes? What are the allowed status code kind of you should emit, and what are the associated error representation for that? So the aim of kind of defining the API standard was to enforce those standard set of guidelines or consistency across our API stack. So a customer partner coming and seeing our APIs, they get that uniform view and the same experience across our APIs. So this was our way to enforce all the standards patterns into the API development. So as part of the standards, so once we kind of wrote down all the principles, all the styles, the patterns, etc., the next thing was there are how do you enforce the common entity definition across all of our APIs. So what it takes. So there were two different things that we kind of came up with. The first thing was, so there are some kind of entity definition based on industry standard patterns like ISO standards. So be it date, which is RFC 0009, or any of the currency code, country code, those ISO standards. So we came up with set of kind of common entities that we say every API, when they capture a currency code, they should use this. Every API that when they want to capture the address, they should use address. So we came up with the common entities that are based on industry standard. The other set of common components were very specific to the fintech industry, the financial industry, where it made sense kind of for a customer, for a PayPal customer, when he kind of represents a financial instrument in an API, how it should look like. When he wants to describe a payment in an API, how it look like, what is the sender object would look like, what is the receiver object look like. So we defined a common entities for standard-based common entities, also very kind of fintech-specific common entities. So this enforce that all our APIs, when they capture these entities, they follow the kind of same definition. The definition remains the same, the fields remain the same, the constraints remain the same. And the next thing was, so when we started, although we had a kind of a placeholder for all of our APIs in terms of versioning, we never had a versioning principle in place when we started. But we knew that we needed a worsening policy. So this we didn't do right at the beginning, but we did it at some point in time. There were the standards captured on what it kind of takes for an API to be backward compatible. What are the guidelines when you kind of iterating on an API, what to break and what not to break, right? So all those things were there, but there were not of end-to-end life cycle versioning defined for any of our APIs on when do you retire, when you deprecate, what is the time frame between your deprecation and retirement, right? What is the end of life policies? Though all those were not defined in the beginning, but we kind of defined at some point in time, and that's when we had V2 and the versioning policy is out. So in general, so we had all this. We had the business capability model. We had the API standards. We have everything defined. Now we have to define a process that is end to end on for anyone to understand what it takes to build an API and take it to kind of live, right? To make it available to everyone. So we defined kind of 4 phases, what we call define, design, develop, and externalize. And we defined entry and exit criteria for each of these phases. So in the define phase, what you do is the teams submit API proposals on around the use case and what they want to do. And there is a portfolio alignment team within my team who kind of goes through the proposal and finds out what is the value proposition of the API. Is this API really needed? And does it make sense in the context of the business capabilities or kind of what PayPal does? And is there anything of similar kind of capability already exists, similar API already exists in the portfolio? So all those exercises are done in the define phase, and once the API proposal passes that design phase, what we do is we have internal process where we create a kind of GitHub repo for our API development team to start writing the API. So the exit criteria for the define phase is kind of, yes, your API makes sense and it aligns to a particular business capability. So, okay, we are good, and you can now start working on the API design, and that's where the design phase starts. So, design phase starts with the repo, and the kind of team puts forward the design proposal where, so we use OpenAPI spec, for example, to define all our API artifacts, and the team uses OpenAPI spec to define all the URIs, we have a structured kind of a repo on how to develop put the design artifacts where we have your API URIs in the swagger.json, for example, and we have samples, error samples, right? We define, the API doc, the documentation, all those are submitted in the design review. So, and the designer, there are assigned designers that kind of go through. So once the development team does completes the design, and they submit for a review to the central team. And the central team, this set of designers, they look into the pull request and they evaluate that API against the design standards that we have defined. And then there are criteria that are defined as part of that evaluating the design maturity, where a designer goes and kind of either passes a criteria or fails a criteria based on what he wants to evaluate. That's the API maturity model. So once the designer says, kind of whoever reviewing says, API is good, it's at a certain maturity level, so we have some bar of quality for internal APIs different from external APIs. So saying external APIs should be at this maturity level before they can go live, versus internal APIs should be at this maturity level before they go live. So once that is design assessed, it passes the design phase where the API spec is approved. Then the development team, the API development, they start developing based on the artifacts that are approved. For the development team, the artifact serves as the approved artifacts serve input, and they kind of do the code gen out of it, and they start developing. And the other things that they do is when you are doing development, you may iterate on that. So meaning you may need to add new error cases, new error codes, new error scenarios. You may miss something that you want to add, and that goes an iterative phase, and the developer comes back and raises PRs as long as he is not, until the time he is ready to go live. Right? And so between design and develop, it's always iterative and kind of cyclic. So once kind of the development is done, the next thing before it kind of goes to the next phase, which is externalizing API or making it live, is making sure the implementation is per the contract, whatever the approved contract. So we have kind of tools that run test cases against the implementation based on the contract. So our tools generate API mocks, right from the API artifacts, the open API artifacts, and those mock all those kind of verification that run on the implementation. And if the implementation is not per the approved spec, the developer kind of goes and needs to fix it. So once, if it passes that verification phase, then the next level is externalization, where you do all these sort of stuff, saying your security, your rate limiting, writing your documentation, external documentation. So there are several teams in the process that kind of plug into each of these phases. So the moment it passes develop, ready to go live, there is like a docs team that works on the open API artifacts and builds the external kind of documentation for the API. There is the HDK team that kind of takes on what it needs to do to kind of interact with this new API that is built, all the changes kind of that are done. There are we also have professional services within PayPal who kind of face the customer side of the PayPal business. They interact with the customer all the time, and they are the one who kind of evaluate the API with respect to integration readiness. So there are kind of criteria in the maturity model that has set of criterion which evaluates against the API spec whether this API is ready to kind of go live or kind of ready for the integration or not. So this is kind of the complete cycle that we every API development team in PayPal follow. So addition to kind of those things, we kind of build many tools to kind of support our end-to-end life cycle. So we also do the education and kind of continuously educate and train, mentor on API design for all our PMs, the architects we do on a continuous basis. We keep evolving the common objects, the capability model. So the business capability model that kind of I was describing, that is also not everything kind of changed. So we may kind of come across, based on the new business we enter, new partnership we enter, we may come across something which is not covered as part of the capability model we build it. If that happens, we kind of add it to the existing capability model. So our criteria for measuring the quality of API is through the API maturity model, which has set of criteria, and we kind of keep changing, revising as and when we add new standards, we bring new frameworks, everything into the life cycle. So we do all sort of developer APIs. Basically, our stack is polyglot, where our developers develop APIs using REST. Now, recently, GraphQL, gRPC, all those sort of things. And our capability model, all the standards, the guidelines, the lifecycle is kind of built in such a way where we don't care about what the interface or how you are going to expose what is your interface is going to be. So all of these kind of works irrespective of your interface. And the last thing is we kind of continuously we operate in a federated model. So initially we started with the central team, but later we kind of became a bottleneck for everyone. So we wanted to scale. So the thing how we went about it is training the domain architects, the product managers, all the product owners, and training them on a continuous basis, and having them review their APIs right? And it took us some time. It took us more than 2 years to get into the process where we now federate all the API design completely. Now what we do is the central team takes care of writing the standards, changing the capability model, changing the API kind of end-to-end life cycle. But the federated team is the one who kind of reviews the APIs for their domain against these set of standards and principles. Um, so this is kind of a long journey, and building the API culture is a continuous process, and you have to invest for a longer duration. It's a never-ending thing, right? And if you are kind of doing something like that in the company, happy to help. So all of these standards, everything, they are out in open source. So you can find them in PayPal's GitHub repo, the common components, the maturity model, all these things. So if you'd like kind of to understand details about that, feel free to kind of reach out to me. Yeah, and thank you. If you have any questions,
thank you so
I
much.
can take it.